Okay, here we go. South Park. Comedy's in a really interesting place right now. I think it's in a place where we can actually start talking about complex issues during stand-up and during comedic performances. There was a point there where it was difficult to address things like race, sexism, gender, all those things, because we weren't really ready to develop our way of speaking about it as a society. And there were people who thought that anything was okay to be made fun of because it's comedy. You can say whatever you want. And I'm definitely more on that side, but at the same time, I still empathize with people who have more sensitivities. I think anything can be made fun of, absolutely anything, but the more taboo something is, the more skill you need to make fun of it. That's why I want to talk about the time South Park made an episode about the N-word. Yeah, we're doing it. In the actual episode, they say the actual word, South Park, a show made by two white guys, Matt Stone and Trey Parker. And I want to explain whether this was wrong or right and go into more of a conversation about the N-word and how comedy can be used to say whatever you want. This is a big topic and people are going to have loads of emotions about it that are mixed and confused, and some of them will be strong and clear, but I just want you to hear me out. You might not agree with me, but listen to what I have to say. I won't be actually saying the word in the video, and I'll explain why later on. Now, before I go on, I have to say South Park is the best satirical piece of media I have ever seen. The main comedic tactic they use is to heighten people in the way they are so far that it becomes funny and almost ridiculous, but still the essence of what they're talking about is still there. And what I think most people who know about South Park don't know is the fact that a lot of the characters in South Park were not necessarily meant to like. I don't know why I'm wearing these. There are bad people in South Park and we're not meant to agree with what they say. They're also not people we want to emulate. We're almost meant to laugh at them and be like, oh my god, can you imagine if people were like this? Or people are kinda like this. Now this episode was inspired by a clip of Michael Richards, Kramer from Seinfeld, who said the N-word very publicly while actually during a stand-up set. And Trey Parker and Matt Stone saw this and wanted to make an episode about the N-word. In the video, Michael Richards has an outburst where he literally calls a black guy the N-word to his face. I remember showing my friend South Park, and he watched it and he thought that it was this dumb little show with a bunch of cut-out characters that looked so weird. But the thing is, and this is the lamest thing I will ever say, but you have to look at every episode of South Park like almost an essay. You have the people you're meant to agree with and the people you're not meant to agree with, and in the end, they both learn a little bit and then it comes to a conclusion. So to do this, they have to kind of show people doing awful stuff. And what South Park is probably criticized for the most is they play devil's advocate for positions that are kind of indefensible. But that doesn't explain why this show is still allowed to be on after literally having a white guy say the N-word straight off. And the thing is, the reason why South Park is still on TV is because it's South Park. What are you going to do? Like, people will complain about it from time to time and say, can you believe what they did on South Park? Oh my god, South Park. But ultimately, the reason why they get away with it is because it's South Park. Like, what are you going to be annoyed at? It's a show about people being as horrible as possible. And it's kind of hard to complain about that. But also, another reason why it gets away with it is because it's kind of grandfathered in. They just got in there at a time when it was okay to say this kind of stuff. And then eventually people kind of forgot about it until now it's been on TV for almost 30 years. So they're just kind of in the culture. And the third thing is, and you have to give it to them, is South Park is not just dumb toilet humor or offensive humor for its own sake. South Park is a smart show and it clearly has thought put into it, even though each episode takes 6 days to make. And actually, the fourth thing is the fact that with South Park, the characters don't even look real. So that means the fact that they don't look like real people, they can kind of do and say whatever they want, because you don't identify these characters as real people who are being hurt or who are being evil. But anyway, this episode starts with Randy, one of the main characters and one of the boys' fathers, who ends up saying the N-word during a game show where the hint was a puzzle that was people who annoy you, and he had to fill in the puzzle and say the whole word, and he essentially said the N-word. And they were trying to get him to say naggers. Naggers. He then gets known as being the N-word guy, and people start to ostracize him from society for saying the word so publicly. And eventually, through the episode, he literally gets chased by these stereotypical redneck guys because he's become an N-word guy, and they start to ostracize him and make him feel lesser than. He eventually meets a bunch of other N-word people, N-word men, who have publicly said the N-word, one of which being Michael Richards, who is the person who inspired this episode. And in the end, they basically go to Congress, petition them, and they get the term N-word guy removed from the public dictionary, and no one can possibly say it. And at the same time, the B story is Stan, who's the son of the guy who says the N-word. He's trying to speak to his black friend and explain why his black friend, token black, which is a whole other thing, speak to his black friend and explain why it's actually alright that his dad said the N-word on TV, and the fact that his dad's apologized to Jesse Jackson and all that stuff. But the thing is, in the end, Stan comes to the conclusion that he can't tell Token what he feels like because he'll never understand what it feels like to be called the N-word. And eventually the conclusion to the essay of this episode, like I said, and I still hate myself for saying that, is the fact that white people can't really understand what it's like for a black person to be called the N-word. And for a white person to tell a black person how to feel isn't something that they really ever understand. And also, at the same time, if there was a word that was almost nearly as insulting to white people as the N-word is to black people, it would be removed from public discourse and maybe made illegal. Another thing to consider in this situation, why my personal feelings to this might be different to yours, is I was born in Africa, so my ancestors weren't slaves. So I have this weird relationship with the N-word, because the N-word was an insult initially created for African Americans and their ancestors during slavery. But for me, it's like it's become a pejorative for me because of the homogenization of African people and black people. So I'm kind of seen as someone who should be made to feel lesser than by that word. But at the same time, I have no historical, cultural connection to that word being a pejorative. But at the same time, if someone on the streets in the UK just pointed at me and just said it to me, I'd also be hurt and I'd be offended. So it's kind of like, do I have room to essentially claim the word as my own, or am I taking from African American culture a word that actually has deep significance to them? Like, am I allowed to rap to Gold Digger by Kanye West, or am I not? The thing that I think about this episode, and I think is so interesting, is ultimately the point is that white people will never understand what it's like for a black person to hear the N-word, right? That's ultimately the conclusion that they come to. But then why do the creators make the decision to make it such a word that is said multiple times? Because if you're saying the N-word said on live TV in the show would have hurt so many black people, white people will never understand that, then why do you go out of your way to say the N-word on international TV on a show that will probably be watched by loads of black people? And hey, who knows, maybe there's some creative reason where they think the N-word being there makes it more like conducive to being funny, helps to tell the story, whatever. Maybe they're railing against the N-word not being able to be said by white people at all. But that doesn't really seem like what they're saying by the moral of the episode. But honestly, what I think is they wanted to say the N-word because they wanted to get away with saying the N-word. So I'm kind of conflicted, because on one level I'm like, for the purposes of humor, this episode is funny, anything should be on the table, anything should be allowed to be said. But I'm kind of like, this episode undermines itself by using the word in the episode. But I want to make a distinction between this episode's use of the N-word and the way Michael Richards used it, because he was just outwardly shouting it in anger at a black guy. He wasn't even trying to be funny. And notably, when you watch the video, it wasn't even a part of like a joke or a bit. He was just yelling at a black guy who was heckling him and calling him the N-word. And that, I think, is probably the most disgusting part of everything that he did. But look, I'd like to say, I think a lot of people's discussion on this topic ultimately just comes down to white people shouldn't say the N-word, black people should be allowed to say the N-word. But I want to say this is probably one of the best discussions of the N-word I've seen on like public television. Ultimately, I'm sure there's some better analysis of it by actual black people, but sadly the majority of Western television is dominated by white people. So this show is probably the best depiction that I've ever seen of people actually having a conversation about it. And I think we also have to cut it slack, because in 2007, there was a different way of seeing the N word. And I was on the internet in 2007, man. I'm only 25, but even I remember the days when it was like, yeah, you can say the N word as long as it's not in an insult, you can still say the N word. Where now we're more in a world where it's like, no, white people shouldn't really say it either way, because even just hearing the sound come from a white person's mouth kind of just makes black people feel uncomfortable. So, look, I kind of think in this situation, I think this episode is kind of a masterpiece. It's written really well. It's really clever. I would love to see some more black voices talking about this kind of thing rather than just seeing it from a white perspective. At the same time, comedy is comedy, and I believe in like free speech and people being able to say whatever they want. So I wouldn't like ban South Park or ban Trey Parker and Matt Stone. I just think everything they've said has been so funny, and most of the stuff that they do is done in good faith. And this is one of the best discussions I've seen of the N word. So, man, I think ultimately, let it happen. It's okay. The cartoons are so unhuman like that it's kind of hard to take offense to see a cardboard cutout say the N word. It almost makes you feel silly, like complaining about this guy saying anything or doing anything because he's not real. You know what I mean? But man, I love comedy, and comedy is something that I find so interesting endlessly. I could talk about it. If you want to see me do comedy, watch my stand up. If you want to see my thoughts on other comedians, watch my video on my podcast that I had with James Acaster and Jimmy Carr. But guys, this has been a really interesting conversation. If you want me to do more videos like this, let me know. Like, comment, share the video. I honestly love this, and I could talk about this kind of thing forever. I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.